It may or may not. The problem with doing these kinds of, I guess if you want to call lineups or tests or something, is that we don't know what the background smells are in the room. We don't know what the airflow is like in the room. It's really it doesn't tell us much, give us much information, because we don't know how the dog is perceiving that environment. We can't get inside the dog's mind to know what the dog is thinking. Only way the dog has to communicate that to us is by those indications, and there are so many factors that affect whether the dog gives its final trained response, that if you don't actually find something, the occurrence of just a final trained response is not information, is not useful.
And by find something, do you mean take it to a lab and corroborate it?
Correct. It's always been my position and the position of a scientist in this field that the work that scent dogs do, whether it's scent lineup or tracking or any kind of detection dog work, is amazing, and they are detectors beyond the ability of our own detection ability, and so they really are a tool to help us. But without being able to get inside the mind of the dog, if you use the dog to find tangible evidence, if a crime scene team comes in and finds blood or a bone or DNA or an article of clothing that you might not have ever found, you only found because of the dog's ability to scent, that's fantastic. That's why we use these dogs. But if the dog gives a final trained response and you don't find anything, there's too many reasons why they might give a final trained response, and we can't get inside their brain. We don't know what they're thinking. Why did you give a final trained response, even though we can't physically find anything? That it's not valid information.
What possible influence? So these are, I don't know if you can see it on the table here. I know you can't see things to the right, but it's the green shirt and the blue shirt. I've also got the shoes and the jeans that were laid out. First, they were placed in bags 6 feet apart. Does the fact that those bags were in an evidence locker for 109 days become one of those things that could have impacted the dog, as you were describing?
That's exactly right. That's the kind of confound. In other words, we're not telling the dog, go find Dylan Redwine's scent. We can't do that. What we're telling the dog is to try to match to a particular scent, or to find a scent that's interesting because they have been trained to respond to decomposition. But we don't know what they're smelling. We know that there is something that they found interesting there, or it's a false positive. There may be nothing there, and the dog gave a false positive because of factors like cueing and other factors that lead them astray.
Does the fact that the dog alerted to 2 of the bags and not the third have any impact, or does that sort of bolster what you're saying?
That sort of confirms what I'm saying. Why do 2 and not the 1? It's the kind of conflicting information that we get from the dogs. So if you wanted to argue that, I don't know, that hypothetically, because the dog indicated on the 1, then we should send it to the lab and see what they can find on it, that's fine. But just because they indicated on the 1, and especially since they didn't indicate on the other, on its own, without having found some corroborating physical, tangible evidence, there's too many other variables involved in this to have that provide any information.
Doctor, the blue shirt and the green shirt were held in a bag for 109 days together. If there was the scent of human remains on one of those shirts, would having put them in a bag together for that amount of time meant that scent, if it was present, got on both of those items?
Yeah, we would expect that the scent would be on both items. And therefore, we would suspect that the fact that the dog, indicated on one and not on the others is an indication of an error on the part of the dog.
What does it say to you that when the blue shirt was taken off the ground and taken away, that the dog smelled the green shirt, did not alert, but went back to the location where the blue shirt had been and then gave a final trained response?
So, Judge, I'm objecting because this is beyond the scope of his expertise, and this is what we had talked about pre-trial.
No, I don't think that's where he's going. I think it's okay. You can answer.
So, what I think for me, what this alludes to is the fact that this is a dog that is confused and not sure what it's smelling. And for instance, just to give you an example, we can't get inside the dog's mind. We don't know. For instance, it may be that it was rewarded for identifying the blue shirt. Now the blue shirt's gone, and it's going to get rewarded for going to where the blue shirt was. Right? It's saying, okay, how do I get rewarded? How do I do my job correctly and have praise for it? Then I go back to where that blue shirt was. That's a possibility based on scientific principles and how we know the dog's mind work. It may be that there really was a strong enough scent on that blue shirt, and then that scent was, of course, left on the floor very briefly, but on the floor when the blue shirt was removed. But we don't know.
If the scent was that strong, it stands to reason it would have gotten on.
You can't testify.
Well, thanks.
Okay. I think your point is made, however.
Okay. Would that scent have gotten on the bag or the green shirt?
We would
If it got
expect
on the floor?
that's the confusing part about this evidence, and what leads me to conclude this doesn't tell me anything. This is a very interesting exercise, but it doesn't really provide me any information because there's no way for me to really interpret the results.
Moving on to the shoes. If a final trained response occurs to the shoes, and then in the presence of the dog, people go to examine the shoes, how might that impact the dog? Can you say?
Effectively, the dog, by that behavior of the humans, the dog is rewarded, right? So the dog expressed interest in the shoes, gave its final trained response, and now the people go and look at the shoes. Oh, I did it right. See, now they're all interested in it, and I know that I did my job right. So the dog has now been rewarded for going to those shoes.
In your expert opinion, do the alerts to the clothing at Area 51 mean that that clothing had come in contact with a dead body?
No, I think that the results from Area 51 are inconclusive.
Switching gears again, there was an experiment conducted at the impound lot at the sheriff's office. So would a dog like Ms. Corcoran-Gummings be able to reliably find a car in an impound lot where someone had taken their life with a firearm?
I would expect so. Yes.
If humans could smell the decomposition of that human who died by suicide and had left the windows down to air the car out, would that be something that a human remains detection dog would have an easy ability to recognize?
Yeah, if humans can smell it, the dog will have no problem with it.
So different scenario, part of this experiment that happened at the impound lot. There was someone who suffered a fatal drug overdose in a car and was removed from the car within hours after death. But her vomit was still in the car. Would that be a complex problem for a human remains detection dog?
No, that would be simple.
Would exposing a dog to those scents on the same day that you take that dog to a citizen's house pose any risk to reliable alerts later in that day?
I if the dog is well trained, and I'm not questioning that Ms. Corcoran's dog was well trained, I don't think so. I mean, the problem is we don't know. Again, whether that scenting in those very, 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 very strong scents changes. I guess the best word to use is the mood of the dog, or the temperament of the dog, or the drive of the dog, and how it does that. We simply don't know. I mean, these are all fascinating questions we'd love to be able to answer, and we don't have the science to do that. So it would be unclear to me to what degree that would have an effect.
Moving on now from the impound lot to the yard of Mr. Redwine's home. And I think we get yelled at if you say Corcoran. It's Ms. Corcoran.
Oh, I'm
by
sorry.
order of the court. So there's
I have
testimony that
I have a relative myself who says Corcoran, so that's a tough one for me. I will try.
all right. But at Mr. Redwine's yard, it's an 80-degree day in August, and the human remains detection dog went and sat in the stream that runs in front of Mr. Redwine's house. What does that suggest to someone with your expertise?
That suggests that the dog was overheated and was attempting to cool off. Dogs can only cool off by panting and through their paws. They don't sweat from their skin, for instance, like humans do. And so the most effective way to cool off a dog is to have running water over their paws. And so dogs frequently go in streams to cool off.
Before I talk to you any further about the things at Mr. Redwine's house, I think we need to cover the concept of residual odor. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I am.
And what is it?
Residual odor is the concept that if a body is placed in a certain location for a given amount of time, even very briefly, and then removed, leaving behind no physical, actual, tangible materials, skin cells or fluids or anything like that, nothing detectable, that odor remains. And that odor, it can be detected by human remains detection dogs. That's the concept anyway.
Is there scientific support for the existence of a residual odor after the compounds that make up volatile organic compounds are gone?
No, there is one study that was done, and it unfortunately has a number of different problems associated with it. There is one study that was done, I think it was in Belgium, that provided sort of the impetus to this concept, but it's a number of scientists have attempted to replicate it, never been able to replicate the effect. So it's at this time not considered a valid scientific concept, I guess, if you want to call it that.
Dr. Hall, are you talking about the carpet study?
That's correct.
And why is that study controversial?
The study is controversial because of the methodology that they used. For one thing, they only used one breed of dog, Malinois, which are not the most common breed of dog used for a lot of this cadaver dog tracking. They only used 3 dogs, so it was a very, very small sample size of a very specific population of dogs. In other words, these are Belgian Malinois, specifically from Belgium, and quite unlike even Malinois in the United States, for instance. The process that was used to obtain the samples did not prevent possible physical contamination. Now, when we're talking about residual odor, we're talking about a situation in which there is no tangible, measurable material in place. When we're talking about cadaver dogs are very, very good at detecting the odor of decomposition from existing material. We said that with cadaver dogs, you'll find something. There'll be blood, there'll be DNA, there'll be vomit, there'll be bones, there'll be something there that's continuing to produce the odor. In residual odor, there is nothing there. It is only the odor on the surface and in the air that remains. Nothing detectable by, say, a brilliant forensics team from the FBI or machines or anything else. And so there's the possibility that that there was actual contamination of the carpet samples, so that there was something producing decomposition following. There's difficulties in the study with the limited number of controls and blanks that they used. So it was really considered only to be a pilot study. That is, let's try this in a very small sample size in a very casual way and just see if we get anything from these dogs in this situation. They felt that they found something, that they've had saw the ability of the dogs to detect these residual odors. Others jumped on it and said, okay, with this information, let's try to do this in a much bigger way. And that's not been successfully done to date. And so there really is very, very, very little scientific evidence that residual odors actually exist beyond, in the estimation of chemists, about 24 to 48 hours. Now, within 24, maybe 48 hours, we think the dogs may be able to detect a residual odor in a location, in a home or whatever, from a body, from a dead body that was placed in a location and then removed relatively quickly.
So outside 24 to 48 hours, if there's a scent being emitted, then there's something present.
That's correct. That's my understanding of the scientific literature and the current state of the art. There are efforts going on to try to do some more definitive studies to try to establish the degree to which residual odor is a real phenomenon and for how long and so on. But that information is not available to us yet.
And that was something that reviewers of that carpet square study were able to determine, was that something was present on the carpet?
That's been of course speculated based on the procedures that they used, and has been admitted to by the researchers.
And also, suffice to say, it has not been replicated, replication being something important in science?
Yes, absolutely. You can publish something once, but if it can't be replicated by another lab, it's not considered science. Replication is a critical part of science, and none of us as scientists and scientific skeptics, if you want to say, believe a result, are convinced by a result unless it can be replicated. And there have been efforts to replicate this work, and they have not been successful. All of those studies all have deficiencies of one kind or another. None of them were considered definitive. So it leaves it to be a very open question, but the majority of scientists involved in this kind of work do not believe that residual odor could even exist. I mean, there are some reasons why it doesn't make sense. The rate of decomposition of these things, dispersal by wind and breeze and air movement, things like that would really make it very hard for a scientist who's familiar with these things to believe that residual odor could exist. But hey, we've been wrong before. We need to do the replicated definitive studies to show it. Those have not been done, and until those have not been done, we are very skeptical as to whether residual odor exists outside of the 24 to maybe 48-hour window.
So, from a scientific standpoint, what a dog is sensing is the volatile organic compounds. Is that right?
That is correct. Those are the compounds that are given off by decomposing mammalian tissue, including humans, squirrels, dogs, mice, rats, everything else.
And there are some things that are known about that. And when we're saying odor, what we're really talking about is these volatile organic compounds. And there's some things we do know. Does that include whether they're perishable and whether they degrade?
Yes, and that's what I'm talking about, that produces skeptics such as myself about residual odor. And because we know that these volatile organic compounds, we can measure them. We can take in scientific devices, we can capture those compounds, and we can measure them. And so when we do so, there have been many studies that have looked at volatile organic compounds produced by decomposition, quantified them, identified all the different compounds. There are hundreds of them. But we know that they're, well, volatile, hence the name, and that they break down very quickly. And we have an idea about how quickly they break down. And in general, most of them break down into their component parts in about 24 to 48 hours.
So, pardon me if this is obtuse, but hypothetically, what concentration of volatile organic compounds or odor would you expect to be available from a person deceased less than 24 hours, for less than 24 hours, weeks afterwards, weeks, months? And what we're talking about in this case is 109 days. Would that concentration be available if nothing were present?
Hold on a second, please. Objection?
Objection, Your Honor. There hasn't been a foundation that he has expertise to answer this question, and he hasn't identified any literature or peer-reviewed anything that would suggest that he has an answer to this question. So without that type of foundation, I object.
I'm going to sustain on the foundational.
Would there be sufficient concentration at the lengths of time involved in this case for an animal to sense those volatile organic compounds?
Same objection.
Yeah, it's a different. I mean, he's been testifying about this already. So I'm going to let him do it. I think it is close to the line or maybe slightly over it, but I think it's appropriate to answer the question. So can you answer that, Dr. Ha, please?
I don't believe that there would be any compounds remaining to be able to be detected by a dog after 24 to 48 hours, and certainly not after 109 days.
Would the dog's ability to sense something like that be enhanced if, say, a cadaver had been in a location longer? The fact that it was removed within 24 hours under a particular hypothesis suggests to me that the concentration would be lower. Do I make sense?
That's correct. The concentration of residual odor might be we don't know. But might be dependent. It makes sense that it would be dependent on how long the body, the organic material was present. Remember that what we're usually finding is that if a decomposing body is in a location for a long period of time, it tends to have decomposed into the soil, into the ground, into the wood, and therefore there is remaining material. That's not residual odor. That means there's remaining fluids, fats, blood that's there and decomposing and maybe continuing to decompose for years and detectable by a cadaver dog. So if we're saying whether something was there for 24 hours or whether something was there for 24 days and nothing remained, there was a hard surface and nothing was absorbed during decomposition, yes, the longer it was there might be more in the air, the residual odor.
In that situation, is it your opinion that you'd be able to find something? You could corroborate the alert.
In the situation I'm talking about, if a body was, material was in a location for a longer period of time, you would have decomposition, and that would be able to be detected. Yes, that's what we consider, for instance, what we call grave soil. There would be, a forensic lab would be chemically detecting that there had been decomposition going on there. You may only find it because of the dog's nose, but once found, there would be material there to sample and take back to the lab and identify and characterize.
Doctor, are there swig dog best practices for residual odor?
They're not. It's not defined, and it's not considered a detection dog ability.
What is swig dog?
Swig dog is a special working group on dogs as orthogonal detectors. It's a part of an effort by the Department of Justice originally to establish best practices for the use of dogs in detection in the justice system. That is defining the training, the choice, the training, the care, the kenneling, the nutrition, and the training certification use of any kind of detector dog. And they have different sections for the appropriate training for different tasks: bomb detection, drug detection, tracking, cadaver dogs, and so on.
In creating best practices, then, are they making recommendations for what should underlie a certification?
That's correct. The issue has come up that the certification, the training, and the certification, the validity testing of these dogs varies widely across the country, and therefore a courtroom can't know how to use that information because there were no standardized tests for whether a dog is a qualified, let's say, human remains detection dog. And the idea was to provide the best practices guidelines that should dictate the development of certification programs that allow us to know what you got when you're looking at the evidence from a detection dog.
Are there certifications for residual odor?
There are no certifications for residual odor. Again, it doesn't exist as a formal detection dog field.
How reliable would you consider a dog trained on high concentrations of odor to detect a residual odor? So large source sense detecting residual.
Objections
it-
beyond the scope of his expertise.
Hold on, please.
And it's been established that he hasn't done any of these types of trainings or any of that himself. So for him to opine on the training technique and the reliability of it, it's beyond the scope of his expertise.
Animal sensing expertise would allow him an understanding of what level of concentration a smell would need to be in for a dog to sense it.
Well, he doesn't believe there's residual odor anyway, so why are you even asking the question? I mean, it's an obvious answer. So I'm going to sustain it on that basis. It's a waste of time. Go ahead.
Professor, are you familiar with a study that was done by Dr. Lisa Litt with respect to handler expectations affecting scent dog outcomes?
Yes.
What did that study tell us about dog sensing?
What that told us about dog sensing is that these trained final responses can be highly influenced by the handler's beliefs. That is, if a handler believes that there is something there, it will be transmitted to the dog, can be transmitted to the dog, and can affect the dog's production of trained final responses.
Your Honor, at this point, I've got a image that I'd like the professor to look at. It's Defense Exhibit 1222 and 1223. 1222 has been admitted. I spoke with counsel about 1223. It's two admitted exhibits that are side by side. And last I spoke with him, there was no objection to that exhibit. I'd ask to publish it. Dr. Haw has his own copy in front of him.
That's correct, Judge. I have no objection. This is for the record, 1223 is a compilation of 2 of the people's exhibits.
All right. So 1222 is already in, 1223 will be admitted. And are we going to have a copy of it? Yes. Thank you.
Professor, the one I want to start with, I'm not sure that yours had numbers on them, but there's one that on the left corner of the diagram of the living room, it says People's Exhibit 470. May I orient your attention to that one, please?
I don't have a 470 on mine.
Do you have one that shows a diagram with blue highlights?
Yes, I do.
And on that particular rectangle at the bottom left, does it say in red 470?
Not in the copy that I printed in front of me.
Okay. So on the left side of it, it says August 14th, 2013, looks to be a diagram of a home.
Yes.
Yep, that's the one. Cool. So with respect to this exhibit, there was an alert in the northeast corner of the living room.
Yes.
And at the northeast corner of the living room, as depicted in this exhibit, there is a coffee table, and it's lettered D. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And in the image on the right of that, there are arrows pointing to items of furniture in the living room. You see that?
Yes. Yes, I do.
And so what that is indicating is that on the coffee table, there was something that the Colorado Bureau of Investigation identified as blood. Are you able to see that?
Yes, I see that.
What does the indication in the northeast corner of the living room, well, one more thing. The item of furniture that is labeled B, and it would be to the west in the living room. Are you able to see that? I know it's sort of
Yes.
small print.
Yep.
That item, to make this really confusing, had once been in the northeast corner of the living room. So you'll have to shift it in the diagram, but it would be how it appears in the photograph with the arrows pointing to it. Am I making sense?
Yes.
Okay. So that the time that there were 2 items in that corner that had DNA and blood on them, what would that tell you? So if a dog alerted there, is a dog alerting to residual odor of a human body or something else in your professional opinion?
It would be my professional opinion that the dog is alerting to the decomposition gases from that biological material that was found in that location.
So if there's been identified a little bit of blood on that coffee table that's in that corner, is there some pooling of the compounds, or is there something there for the dog to sense?
That's correct. So this is not residual odor. This is the dog accurately detecting the presence of that blood sample. Now, the reason that it may not have found that sample is, again, because the gases will have moved, will have pooled, sunk to the ground, been moved by air conditioning, airflow, been captured into that corner, I would think, allowing the dog to have a sufficient concentration there to detect.
Is that what would be called a true positive?
Yes, that's a true positive for a human remains dog.
Your Honor, may I approach? I would like to point at the screen for this next question.
So the jury can see what you're talking about?
Yes, sir.
I think that's fine, unless you have an objection to that, do you?
No, Your Honor.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe we should have. Are you going to be there long?
No.
All right. We need to just turn it on where it says mute, I think. Is that what it is?
Dr. Ha, I am pointing at what is marked B. You just talked about it for a moment.
Yes.
It's the item that had once been in the northeast portion of the living room, but is now against the west wall.
Yes.
There was a dog alert to that corner of that couch. Are you able to see that on the diagram?
Yes.
And there was an identification by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation of no blood, but they did find DNA that they associated with Mr. Redwine, Dylan, and Corey Redwine. Are you able to see that? It's the top blue box.
Yes.
Is that what's your opinion as to what that is? Is that a true positive?
Again, that's a true positive for a cadaver dog. There's a clear a biological material there, and the breakdown of that biological material is producing a scent that the dog can detect.
There's another item that's marked C, and on item C, there was blood associated with Dylan Redwine, identified by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. Are you oriented to the west side of item C?
Yes.
The fact that there was blood identified by Colorado Bureau of Investigations at that spot and the dog did not alert, what would you call that?
That would be a false negative.
And then there are
That's
other
that's an
items.
excuse me. That's an error on the part of the dog, a false negative.
And then is it your opinion that these other locations, well, let me start first with the blue, it's kind of a rectangle at the door. Do you see that? It's on the east side.
Yes.
That is the threshold. It was removed. And at any rate, there are dozens of law enforcement, first responders coming over that threshold. Would that have any influence on what you think a dog might sense there?
Yes, we standardly, the process in this is to reject that kind of information because that's a contaminated area. That's a high traffic contaminated area. Unless the crime scene has been extremely well contained and the search is done very, very quickly, that's a common contamination point.
And then at these other locations, so we've talked about a true positive, a false negative. What else is there? And are they present in this living room in your professional opinion?
Well,
That's beyond the scope of his expertise.
Hold on. You're saying it's beyond the scope?
Yes, Your Honor. He's talked a lot about dogs' noses and sensory systems and all that, but to have him go through and talk and characterize these as false positives or false negatives with no training experience is beyond his scope.
Well, I think it's within the scope. I think there's another objection you could raise, but
The fact that it's not in his report at all, I would object to that too.
all right, I understand that. But we've already gotten through this with some other things. I think there's another objection that it doesn't matter. You can go forward, Mr. Moran.
Are there any false positives in that room?
the only other place that I see that I believe the blue dot at the upper part of the house is an indication by the dog, and that would seem to be the question is whether that's a true positive or an error remains open.
Let me switch gears. There was some testimony that it's wise to make sure that a dog is in and out of a location it's sniffing. From an animal behavior standpoint, why is that a good idea to not linger with one of these detector dogs?
Well, because of this idea that they can get frustrated, and so if you're in an area, if you keep a dog in an area and it's not finding anything, then it's not being rewarded. And what will happen is that these dogs want to make their handlers happy. They want to be rewarded. Dogs seek reward, as most of us know. And so if you leave the dog in the area for too long a period of time, it tends to produce a pressure on them to, quote, find something. That is, to do something to get rewarded. And the best way they know to get rewarded is to do a final trained response. And so the longer you leave them in the area, the more likely it would be that they would give a false positive.
Is an hour spent in a house this size, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 to 1,500 square feet, too long from an animal behavior standpoint?
From my knowledge of basic dog cognition, I would say that is a very long period of time.
Would any possible detriment to act by the fact that there are two others aside from the handler present in this space for that hour?
Objection. That misstates the evidence and creates a false impression for the doctor.
There was one person at the threshold, but the other investigator was in the room. Does that impact?
Objection. That
Hold on.
misstates the testimony, Judge. The testimony from the investigator was that they were at the threshold while Ms. Corcoran worked her dog.
There was Investigator Goldbright, Investigator Cowing present inside the room while the work was being done
At the doorway was my
at the
understanding.
threshold. Yes, acknowledged.
Okay, so did you hear all that, Dr. Ha?
Yes.
Okay. So
Okay,
go ahead and
ready?
answer the question. Answer the
Okay.
question, understanding the investigators were at the doorway. Go ahead.
Okay.
Might
It
that
doesn't
have-
matter.
Sorry, go ahead.
It doesn't matter whether the investigators were physically in the room or present at the doorway. The question would be, are the investigators in a position such that the dog was aware that they were present? So whether they're physically, their feet are on this floor plan or their heads are stuck in the door, doesn't matter. What we find in general principles is that that's more people to please, and that increases the pressure on the dog. So it's generally best practices to have the dog either go in alone or go in just with the handler.
Professor, let's leave the house. I'd like to take you now to Middle Mountain. The dog was taken up onto Middle Mountain for 2 days, and it alerted at least 12 times. What would it mean from an animal behavior standpoint if none of those alerts were at locations where remains were actually discovered?
It would mean that you have a large number of false positives, which is not unusual for human remains detection dogs. It would be something that if I was training the trainers, I would be concerned about in a dog. However, most of these trainers, for good reasons, are lenient about allowing false positives because the idea is to find something. And they would rather have the dogs give a final trained response and find nothing than the flip side, which is to have them go past something, miss something. And so they tend to be lenient as long as we don't interpret these false positives as some kind of information. We simply say, oop, the dog got a little overly happy there and tried to get a reward. Let's move on and try and really find something that's important. Then it's not an issue. So many trainers, I think for justifiable reasons, will be lenient, let's say, about these high numbers of false positives. And that's why just simply the fact that the dog does a final trained response, gives a positive response, in my opinion, is not evidence, is not reliable information.
Doctor, you mentioned this in an answer to another question, but there's something called grave soil. What creates that grave soil?
Grave soil is basically the soil that's found under a decomposing mammalian, I suppose other animals too. Any kind of mammal, any kind of animal that's decomposing will decompose into fluids. As the cells break down, the fluid is produced. That fluid can leak down into generally will leak down into the soil and soak the soil. Decomposition continues in that soil. In fact, it actually speeds up in that grave soil, but it produces a certain color. It produces a certain smell. It's detectable by chemical reactions, and of course, since decomposition is continuing to go on in those fluids, it's detectable by a cadaver dog.
When dogs have been trained with human remains that include bones, if bones had been chewed on by carnivores or scavengers and shavings of the bones fall to the ground, is that something a dog might alert to?
Sure. Yes. That's again, the bone itself will decompose. It doesn't produce a lot of scent, so it's difficult to detect, but it is certainly detectable.
So where the dog alerts, you would look for that as well, right?
Look for the bone shavings, the remains of bone, and so on. Sure.
We're getting there, doctor, and thank you everyone for your patience. There's one last thing that Ms. Corcoran was brought back to sniff. It was the Dodge truck of Mr. Redwine. You've reviewed materials with respect to that Dodge, is that right?
Yes, I did.
And saw that the Dodge was sniffed 1 year, 2 months, and 25 days after Dylan went missing.
Yes.
Based on your expertise in dog sensory capabilities, would a human remains detection dog be able to reliably identify human remains in the bed of a truck after the passage of that much time?
If there was detectable material left behind, yes.
Does the fact that the truck was stored outside, would that have any impact on it?
That would cause more rapid deterioration, decomposition, and the loss of detectable material.
Say that Dodge pickup truck had human hairs, fingernail clipping inside of it. Would that cause a dog to alert?
It could, yes, that's what they search for.
Would a dog alerting in that car be distinguishing between the smell of death and the smell of a fingernail clipping and hair?
No, it's all decomposition, and they're trained on a variety of different kinds of decomposition, and so any of that is decomposing material.
If the dog that sniffed that Dodge was inserted into the Dodge, if it was picked up and placed into the bed of the truck, would that be a potential cueing situation?
Exactly. That's why it's against best practices to do that. And so it's just a contributing factor to this cueing, this influencing the mindset of the dog and how it responds.
Same thing with picking it up and inserting it into the passenger compartment, same principle.
Yeah, same thing.
And does the fact, would the fact that a dog is 8 years old at the point it's being picked up and lifted into a vehicle, that also influences it?
Well, age can cause a decline and can be very rapid decline in their sensory functioning. And so at that age, it's especially important to have certifications done so that you know that the dog is actually able to still continue detecting.
In your considered expert opinion, can you say with a reasonable degree of scientific certainty whether Ms. Corcoran Gumming's dog was sensing a dead body or something else in Mr. Redwine's house 109 days after Dylan went missing?
I cannot say that. I cannot say that. It's too confounded.
Are you able to say whether it was a dead body or something else on Mr. Redwine's clothing?
No, I cannot. I cannot. It's all confounded.
And then with respect to the Dodge, it could be the other items from a live human that are causing the dog to alert?
That's correct. I mean, that's the problem with this whole concept of residual odor. It's too intangible. When the dog locates actual biological material, that's a great thing, and they can do it to a degree that we cannot. If they give a positive final chain response, and there's nothing detectable there by a good quality investigation, we cannot interpret that information.
Thank you, Doctor. I believe the prosecution will have some questions for you. Thank you, sir.
All right, I think this is probably, you're not going to be 5 minutes, right?
No, Your Honor.
Let's take a recess then. We'll go to till 25 till 11. So, everybody rise for the jury? Let's take those. That's why I put them there. All right, we'll be in recess.
You say 25 or 45?
I heard him say 25. That's what, and I was like, 8 minutes, okay.
Seemed quick. Yeah, that's this one.
We have 2 cables now. Yeah, they both work.
Yeah, you weren't here when we upgraded.
Please rise.
Thank you. Be seated till the chair comes.
Yeah, why don't you? I think you might need it. Well, you know what? I don't have mine either. Thank you. All rise for the jury. All right, we can be seated. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Dr. Ha.
Hello?
Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can.
So, Dr. Ha, you didn't write a report in this case, did you?
I did not.
And we've been asking for it since we talked on June 19th of 2019, correct?
Objection, Your Honor. That's beyond what this witness can testify about. That's between the parties, and the defense complied with court orders on this
You know,
issue.
there's a lot of dispute about it. Suffice it to say, there was no report written. What else do you want to do?
That I asked him for if he had a report on June 19th of 2019.
Which is when he talked, okay, I think that's fair game.
That was something defense counsel was involved in based on orders of this court. There was no requirement that he write one.
That's fine. He was asked for it, was what the question is. So were you asked for it, Dr. Ha?
As far as I know, no.
Okay.
We didn't discuss whether you'd written a report on June 19th of 2019.
I don't recall that.
Did defense counsel ever ask you to write a report for the
No, that I'm not
prosecution?
gonna let you ask. Okay, what they did with their expert.
So, Dr. Ha, you did provide an expert opinion in an interview on June 19th of 2019, correct?
Correct.
And we asked you if we could record it to be as accurate as possible. You recall that?
Yes, I do.
And you declined to allow us to record it, correct?
Correct.
And you've had approximately 2 years to provide any clarifications or additions to that expert opinion, correct?
Correct.
And you've given us no more reports or opinions after that interview. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
On June 19th of 2019, you stated that you formed an opinion based on material you'd reviewed with regard to the validity of cadaver dogs, correct?
Correct.
And at that time, you'd received hundreds of files and records in discovery.
That's correct.
And that included all the exhibits that the jury's already seen, right?
Correct.
Because we give all those materials to defense counsel and to you to review, correct?
Correct.
And you reviewed them for a few months before you gave that opinion on June 19th of 2019, correct?
Correct.
And then you also provided a curriculum vitae to the people back in June of 2019 or thereabouts, right?
That's correct.
And that was the curriculum vitae we talked about that didn't have any training with cadaver dogs, human remain dogs, or handling listed on it. Correct?
That is correct. Yes.
And it had no experience handling a human remains detection dog on it, correct?
Correct.
No publications in the area of human remain detection canines or canine handling, correct?
Correct. Sorry. Correct.
And back in 2019, that CV that the jury heard about, that was primarily about the behavior of animals, right?
Correct.
And your work at the time is primarily as a behaviorist who helps people in their homes with pets, correct?
No, my primary work is as an academic professor at the University of Washington. That's a sideline helping people in their homes.
At that course, have you ever taught human remains detection canine handling?
I have discussed the principles of canine handling for human remains detection. Yes.
Have you had a course listed as that at the university, sir?
No, only as a topic within other courses.
And it's nowhere on your CV. You'd agree with me?
No. Yes, I would agree with you.
And in our interview, you said you testified as an expert before, correct?
That's correct.
And at the time that I asked you about that, you couldn't tell me the jurisdictions or the case numbers, right?
That's correct.
And you couldn't tell me they weren't listed on your CV that you provided to the people, right?
That's correct.
And you couldn't even tell me the area of expertise you were qualified in back in June 19th of 2019 so that I could go look into it. Is that correct?
That's correct. I don't keep a record of that.
Now, you mentioned your work with the FBI that you called training the trainer. You recall that?
I do.
And you did that even though you've never done the work yourself?
That's correct.
And you've never brought a dog through certification process?
That's correct.
And you've never been invited to sit on a board that certifies canines in handling?
That's correct.
And that's not on your CV either, any work with the FBI?
Correct.
So again, we can't reach out and verify what your actual role was in training the trainer, correct?
Correct.
And now today, after preparing for trial testimony, you said several things for the first time. Am I right?
I don't know what you're alluding to.
You gave a specific analysis of searches that you didn't talk about in our interview, correct?
Yes.
And in our interview with your expert opinion, you never before said that there was a 24 to 48 hour time span on residual odor, correct?
I don't recall. I've always believed that was true, so I don't know why I would not have. But
And normally I give you the courtesy of letting you review this H-page report, but you're remote. You recall talking to investigator Heidel on June 19th of 2019.
yes, I do.
And nowhere in that report do you give any time frame on how long residual odor remains.
I will take your word for it.
Mr. Moran?
I'll leave it at that.
Okay, go ahead.
That's a new opinion for today.
Your Honor,
I
Hold on, there's an objection, Mr. Moran.
The court is allowed its basic trial. It's basic for trials when experts are testifying that they can remark on the information provided by other folks in the trial. And that's what he's doing. So of course there are new things based on the testimony provided by the prosecution. This is not relevant, helpful to the jury. So 401 and 403.
Of course it's relevant,
Well,
Your Honor.
It's relevant.
Highly relevant.
I'll have them rule it in your favor. So you
Thank
don't
you,
need to say
Judge.
anything. Go ahead.
Have you ever provided any materials in this case ever that suggested that there's a time limit of 24 to 48 hours on residual odor?
Mr. Moran, is that the same objection?
Your Honor, he has. This is mischaracterizing what happened. So if he's going to impeach him, he's going to need to use the document to do so.
Not necessarily. He can call Mr. Heidel up as for a prior inconsistent witness if that's how he chooses to go. So you understand, questions are not evidence. All right, you can rely on what the expert, well, not the experts, but the experts, but the witnesses and any future witnesses to make your determination. Go ahead.
So that's have you ever provided any information to the prosecution in this case that there's a 24 to 48 hour time limit on residual odor?
I don't know. I may not have. If I was not asked the question, I would not have provided the information.
Have you ever published anything that suggests that?
No.
Cite me something in published peer-reviewed literature that says 24, 48 hours. Cite that to me, please.
I can't do that off the top of my head. There's a number of publications about volatile organic compounds. I have a literature search and a database full of those papers, but I don't have those at my fingertips.
But you're the expert here, coming in here purporting to know about human remains detection canines, correct?
Correct?
And you know residual odor is fundamental
Hold on,
to the discussion.
Hold on. Mr. Moran?
This is getting argumentative.
No, his voice is just getting loud. The questions aren't argumentative at this point. Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. And you're aware that this issue is one before the jury today, right? You knew that coming in?
Yes.
Okay. And you have a PhD
Yes.
in zoology. You
Yes.
purport to have read the literature on topic, and you can't cite me a single cite on that.
Yes. There's a large literature on this, and I cannot cite you an individual article on it.
Okay. Defendant's paying you to be here, right?
That's correct.
Okay. He's paying you for all of your work on this case, correct?
Hold
Objection,
on.
Your
Actually-
Honor.
Hold on. What's your objection?
Everybody who's testified in this case got paid.
I hope not.
Well,
Maybe experts have been.
right.
All
This
right.
is- this is
and
not
that's fine,
relevant.
but this is totally fine, Mr. Moran. This is typical cross-examination on an expert witness.
The first question, fine, but to delve into this and the way he's doing so and to have Mr. Redwine implicated in it is violative, in my mind, of 1.6. That's something that Mr. Redwine has the ability through his attorneys to have privileged.
That's not
No.
a thing, Judge.
No, we're not going to go into any privilege. He can talk about how he's getting compensated. That's perfectly fine. It's appropriate for the jury to consider in terms of judging credibility. So go ahead.
So, Dr. Howe, you live in Key West, Florida, right?
Marathon, Florida.
Oh, okay. And you have no certified human remains detection handling experience, correct?
That's correct.
But the defense has reached out to you all the way in Florida to pay you for your time to review records in this case about human remains detection canines, right?
That's correct.
And then pay you to watch the testimony of the handlers, I believe, right? Sit in on it so that you could comment afterwards.
Correct.
And they pay you for any report writing, which as you advertise on your website, although here they chose not to, correct?
Correct.
They paid you to fly in from Florida to come testify and give your opinion on Friday, and then they're continuing to pay you to give your opinion today.
Yes.
Okay. I want to discuss a couple of general principles with you, if you would. So, are you aware of some of the national certification processes and how they work?
Not in any detail, no.
Do you know the certification process that K9 Molly went through?
Only that she went through a standardized certification process, yes.
You don't know the details of what that process looked like, and you have an opinion in this case?
Yes.
So do you know what agencies, national agencies that certify police dogs all the time that go into service? Do you know what national agencies those are that she's certified with?
Yes, and as I've already testified, I am not a handler. I am not a certification expert. I am not an expert on how the certifications are put together. I am addressing the value of the evidence from the scientific point of view on basic principles of dog cognition and learning. So I am happy to accept that there is a national certification program and that Molly passed that. And I don't need to know the details of it, that I accept that it was nationally certified.
Well, I thought so too, Doctor. I thought that's what your expertise was going to be. But then during your direct testimony, you talked an awful lot about, for example, Ray Randolph's certification. You recall those questions?
Only the type of certification that she had.
Okay. And you also talked a lot about the things that the handlers did and the reliability of it. And you stressed that training is important.
That's correct.
And having an unbiased person do that certification is important.
That's correct.
Because it demonstrates reliability in a controlled setting. So then when that dog is deployed, we can trust the reliability of that dog.
I have no argument with this.
Okay. So I just want to ask you about some general principles, however. So you know, at least I would assume, doctor, that when a dog certifies, that the handler works with the dog to certify.
I'm sorry, I missed the last part. Works with the dog.
That an independent certifier sets up the problems and the handler works with a specific dog to do the certification. You're at least aware of that, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. And when they certify, they're certified together as a team, correct?
Absolutely correct.
Okay. But when you originally opined on this case, it was your original opinion that the handler should not be present for the work as a measure to avoid queuing, correct?
That's correct.
And you suggested, despite the certification of the dog and handler being together, that someone else should handle the dog. That was something you said in your expert opinion, correct?
Correct.
Now, doctor, you're familiar with Dr. R. Padvas's work, right?
Yep. Yes.
And you've had the opportunity to review it, right?
Yes.
Tell me if I'm getting anything wrong, but Dr. Arpad Voss has endeavored to define a specific odor signature for human cadavers.
Exactly.
Okay. And in doing so, he's determined there are 478 volatile organic compounds.
Correct.
And this is different than any other composition out there, right?
That's
It's
correct.
unique. And it's different than, for example, animal odor signatures decomposing, correct?
That's not correct.
So your testimony here today is that a decomposing animal has the same odor signature as a decomposing human.
Not the same odor signature, but an overlapping odor signature.
Well, sure, a lot of things have overlapping odor signatures, correct?
Correct.
But Dr. Arpad Voss, whose literature you're familiar with, has identified that the human remains are unique and different from animal remains.
Human remains have over 400 different compounds when they decompose. A significant portion of those compounds are shared by other mammals, by other animals. And so humans do have a unique collection of odors, but many of those odors are shared by other animals when they decompose.
Yes, you already said they overlap, but my question is, are they unique to each other?
The collection of them are unique to each other. Yes.
Thank you, doctor. And that's why it's important that dog handlers train only on real human remains, right?
That's correct.
There's been some history back in older times when people would train on pig remains because they had some overlap in the signatures, right?
It's still very common just to use pig remains for training, yes.
But you're aware from Swigdog and Dr. Arpad Voss, et cetera, that what you should do is train on real human remains for that reason.
That's correct.
That's how you create a dog that will identify on real human remains and not have a false positive on animal remains, correct?
That's never been demonstrated. The problem is that we can't get inside the dog's mind and know which of the 470 some odd odors the dog is queuing on. There's no evidence that the dog is queuing on the collection of the unique collection of 478. So we don't know what one or multiple smells, odors, chemicals the dog is queuing on. And therefore, we don't know whether it's queuing on ones which will overlap with animals or not.
Well, you don't know that, but a trainer that has trained on human remains only and proofed off of animals and done various documented training exercises and has gone through national certification processes, a handler like that's going to know that, right?
Objection compound.
No, it's not. It's fine. You can answer the question.
Can you restate the question?
Yes. You said you don't know what's in a dog's mind. But a handler who does training exercises to proof their dog off of animal remains, who documents those training records, who takes that dog to a national agency to certify, that person's going to know from the training and performance in a controlled setting that the dog can distinguish the two odors, correct?
No, that individual is still not going to know how the dog is perceiving the world inside its mind. It
Okay.
knows that it will do it accurately under those specific conditions. Yes.
Sure. So you're going to agree with your original opinion today that one of the reasons a certified, nationally certified dog with field experience and training that's put out on important missions might have false positive in this case is because of something like a dead mouse is close enough. That's your opinion?
That is. I mean, that's one possibility.
Close enough. A dead mouse is close enough.
It
That's a
may be
possibility.
close enough. It may be close enough.
Let's talk about Karen Corcoran. You ever observe Karen Corcoran work?
No.
You ever see her work with a human remains detection dog?
No.
You ever see her work with a trailing dog or a narcotics dog or a police dog as a sworn police officer investigating a crime?
No.
Did you observe her work in this case?
No.
Did you see any of the areas that she searched in person?
No.
Did you go out to the residence or the mountain or any of those areas?
No.
You ever meet Canine Molly?
No.
So you've never seen her work,
Correct.
correct? You've never seen her in a training setting.
Correct.
You've never seen her out in the field.
Correct.
And you didn't actually observe the work that she did in this case.
That's correct.
You just read some reports.
Correct.
Are you aware that Molly has previously given a trained final response on residual odor 4 years after the human remains were removed?
No.
Didn't you watch her testimony?
Only parts of it.
Are you aware that in this case, Molly did a car lineup with over a dozen cars where she had no information, the handler had no information as to which cars had dead bodies, and she was able to indicate on 2 of them? You're aware of that?
Yes.
You're aware that both those bodies had been removed for over a year and she got both cars?
Yes.
She didn't alert on any of the others.
Yes.
And you're aware in one of those cars that there was no blood or guts or gore. It was a person who had overdosed and had only been in the car 20 minutes and was still warm to the touch a year earlier. You're aware of that, right?
Yes.
How many bodies has Molly found in her time working as a human remains detection dog?
I don't know.
You have an opinion on her reliability and you don't know how many bodies she's found?
No.
You'd agree I put that material in discovery for your review, correct?
Yes. I'm not questioning that Molly is a highly trained cadaver dog. I'm questioning the idea of residual odor.
So you're aware in this case she didn't indicate on every room, right?
Correct.
You'd agree she didn't indicate on every article of clothing, correct?
Correct.
And she didn't indicate on every truck she searched, correct?
Correct.
And are you aware that up on Middle Mountain Road, the areas that she did indicated were right in the general area of where Dylan's body had been chewed up by animals and dispersed as they scavenged? Are you aware of that?
Correct.
And you're aware that the areas she indicated were areas where snow had melted and rain had melted, and she was able to find locations in there, the odor of human remains with a trained final response. You're aware of that as well, right?
Objection as to the form of that question. I think that it's assuming facts, not in evidence.
Well, I think it's in evidence.
That dog's not alerting to any place things were found. The closest it gets is 20 feet.
That wasn't the question. That wasn't the question. Go ahead.
You aware of that, doctor?
I'm aware that she provided a number of false positives and that nothing was actually found in the locations that she indicated.
Doctor, you've already testified on direct that you don't call it a false positive in the field because you don't know if there's human remains there or not when the dog indicates. You remember testifying to that?
Now wait, my understanding is that she indicated in several locations and nothing was found in those locations.
Right. But, well, I understand you don't believe in residual odor. But what we were talking about here is an area where it was documented that there had been numerous human remains scattered, drugged, and moved about in that same area where she's doing train's final response. It'd be your position that that's a false positive?
We've seen the evidence that the testimony about the pinpointing and the very precise accuracy of these dogs. And so if nothing is found in that location, to me, that has to be a false positive.
Uh-huh. So in your original opinion, on June 19th of 2019, after months of reading the records, right, and hundreds of records have been provided to you about Officer Corcoran at the time, in that original opinion, you cited only 3 specific concerns you had with Officer Corcoran's handling, correct?
Correct.
You were concerned with queuing, you were concerned with the time passed, and we'll get to residual odor, and you were concerned that she was not certified. That's what you put in your expert opinion, correct?
Correct.
So let's start with queuing. I think we'd all agree queuing can be a problem for dog handlers, correct?
Correct.
You need good practices to prevent this. We can all agree on that?
Correct.
To prevent this, you listed some of the things in your original opinion that you'd like to see. For example, working a dog off leash, right?
Correct.
Minimal information going into a search.
Correct.
Blind testing.
Correct.
Certification to prove they can do it by an unbiased evaluator.
Correct.
Not letting a dog run in an area for too long.
Correct.
And to reward whether or not there is a trained final response.
Correct.
You'd agree with me that these are all good measures to prevent queuing.
Correct.
Let's talk about cadaver odor in general. So you understand that residual odor is a term of art and it has a definition and it's acknowledged by SWGDOG. You'd agree with me on that, right?
Residual odor is there are not standards in SWGDOG for residual odor.
That's not what I asked you. I asked you, will you agree with me that residual odor is a concept that is acknowledged by SWGDOG? It's even defined.
Yes. Yes. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. And generally speaking, it's when odors left behind and the human remains are no longer there, right?
Correct.
And you'd agree with me that it's the same odor, it's just possibly reduced quantity.
We don't know that.
Well, you knew that on June 19th of 2019 when you interviewed with Investigator Heidel and myself, right?
It will. Okay, let me rephrase then. It will be reduced concentration. No, yes, no question about that. But it may also be different compounds. In other words, only certain compounds may remain as residual.
Your statement to Investigator Heidel was, you explained that you see the difference in being the difference in how the odor is transferred and the quantity of odor. You recall that?
Objection.
Yes.
This has got to be asked. Did you say that? But too late. This is improper impeachment.
That's not, he's reading it, the jury can see him reading it, and then he's saying, this is what you said.
Right. So reading transcripts or Mr. Heidel's report into the record is what I'm saying is improper impeachment.
Well,
You
it
asked
is-
the witness, did you say this? And then
Hold
you
on.
impeach them later.
I don't see a difference here. Again, questions are not evidence, ladies and gentlemen. Listen to the responses. Go ahead.
And your response in this instance to, you see the difference in being the difference in how the odor is transferred and the quantity of odor, your answer to that was yes.
Correct.
Okay. And additionally, you added that it would be the same odor, but you would want to know that the canine could locate the reduced quantity. That was another statement you made in your expert opinion, correct?
Yes.
You'd agree with me that there's no actual published literature that distinguishes the odor signature, correct?
Distinguishes which odor signature?
A unique odor signature different for residual odor than for human remains odor.
No, there's no literature.
Okay. And you've never published anything on the topic?
No.
And there's no distinction in the certifying organizations or SWGDOG. There's no specific training track or certification for residual odor, right?
That's correct.
They just certify in the odor of human remains, be it residual or not.
They only certify on the existence of remains.
Right, but the canine is indicating on the odor, correct?
Correct.
Let's talk a little bit about studies regarding residual odor. you talked about Swig Dog and how that's a concept within Swig Dog, right? And we already talked about 24 to 48 hours, and you agree with me there's just no studies that say anything like that, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And are you aware of any studies that suggest that there is a time limit on residual odor?
There are no studies on residual odor. This is my educated opinion.
Based on what?
Based on,
If it's not, let me ask you a different question. If it's not based on published literature in the field, what is it based on?
so it's based on studies of volatile organic compounds produced by decomposition and the rate at which they decompose in the environment.
So there are studies on the topics, though, that indicate that residual odor can be found at lengths of time after the remains have been removed, correct?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, well, let's just start with an easy one. Dr. Arpad Voss, right? His
Yes.
studies are collecting odor, right?
Correct.
He creates an instrument that collects the odor. It's not as sensitive as a dog, and he'd be the first one to acknowledge it if you speak to him. But what he does is he actually collects the odor in the air. He's not collecting the human remains. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
So his scientific instrument is showing that you can, in fact, collect residual odor, and it's not as good as a dog.
Yes.
We talked about carpet squares, right? And that's a peer-reviewed scientific article, right?
Correct.
And that's from Science Direct. That's Cadaver Dogs, a study on detection of contaminated carpet squares, right?
That's not the journal, but that's where the library of where you got the article from. But yes,
Is it Forensic Science International?
that's correct.
Thank you, sir. So, and counsel asked you about the problems with it, but he didn't talk to you about what the actual project and findings were in detail, right?
Right.
And what we learned from that study was that these were bodies that had been in no contact with the surface at all, right? The carpet squares.
Correct.
And they had been dead only 2 hours or less, right?
Correct.
And they had been present only for 10 minutes at the location, correct?
Correct.
And when they were present for 10 minutes at the location, there was a 98% rate 65 days later that they were able to detect residual odor.
Correct. That's what they
You'd
report.
agree? And that's a lot longer than 24 to 48 hours, wouldn't you agree?
I agree.
Where's the study that debunked this study? Cite us the doctor and the article that's peer-reviewed and published that debunked the carpet squares.
At this time, there is not yet one.
Okay, but you talked about repetitiveness being helpful and part of the scientific process, right?
Correct.
Are you aware of Dr. Michael Alexander's work?
No.
No? You're an expert in the field. You're here testifying as an expert before the jury, and you're not aware of his work?
That's correct.
Are you aware that he determined residual odor could be up to 667 days after human remains are removed with 8 certified human remains detection canines?
Objection,
No, I'm not aware of
Foundation.
that.
Hold on. The foundation, this is proper impeachment. I mean, whether or not that comes into evidence is a different story, but he can ask the question.
Sure. He would have to establish some other things, though, for this to be a learned treatise or something relied on in the field. There's a lack in qualification here.
So you're objecting that the treatise is not something relied upon in the field?
Yes.
Okay,
to
and that's
ask
fine,
this
but
question.
that's a different objection than you first made, so go ahead.
Would you agree with me Forensic Science International is a reliable source that is peer-reviewed?
Yes.
Okay. So you're not aware of the study with Michael Alexander's work that I had just referred that had 8 certified human remains?
Was it published in that in that magazine or periodical?
Yes, Your Honor. I'm holding it.
When was it? When was it? Do you have a date?
Yes, 2014. I thought I had said. I believe it's 2015.
All right. Go ahead.
What's the name of it?
Application of soil and forensic science, residual odor, and human remains detection dogs. You're aware in this study that it was determined 667 days after the remains were removed, and that was by 8 certified human remains detection canines.
He would not be aware of that, having not seen this article.
Well,
So
he can ask if he's he can still ask if he's familiar with this this article and what it found, and then that's pretty much it for the for impeachment on that, at least this issue.
I'll ask a different question, Your Honor.
All right.
So you're unaware when you issued your expert opinion in this case to 24 to 48 hours that 4 single purpose and 4 dual purpose canines blind tested were 75% to 100% accuracy when the remains were not present. You were unaware of that 667 days when you gave your expert opinion to the jury about 24 to 48 hours.
That is correct.
You're also unaware that some of those dogs went through NNDDA and NAPDWA national certifications, just like Officer Corcoran's dog. You're unaware of that too?
I'm unaware of the study. Therefore, I am unaware of anything having to do with the study.
So you'd agree with me, certification is very important?
Yes.
And when you issued your opinion on June 19th of 2019, at the time of that opinion, your concern was that Officer Corcoran's dog had no certification. That's what you told us in the interview, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And part of the basis of your opinion as to her reliability was your concern that she didn't have records that indicated she'd been tested, right?
Correct.
One of the primary concerns was a, quote, lack of certification, right?
Correct.
And you were concerned that Molly didn't have unequivocal testing or assessment, correct?
Correct.
That was your understanding and issuing an opinion after having the records for a few months.
Correct.
Would you agree with me?
Object.
Hold on, there's an objection.
Object to any further discussion about the records. This was something that the prosecution did not want us to get into, and so if the records are going to be discussed, it's beyond the scope.
This goes to, I think I know where this is going based upon previous testimony. And, you know, this is being brought up now, and you may be able to go into it on redirect. We'll see.
If it's helpful, Judge, these are quotes from that report that he's been limited to. So I'm actually reading from
I
okay.
understand that, but that's not what Mr. Moran is saying. So go ahead.
You'd agree with me that there are good dogs and good handlers out there that do good work, wouldn't you?
Absolutely correct.
Okay. And doctor, would you agree with me that dogs can smell what we can't at a very sensitive level?
That's correct.
And you'd agree with Dr. Arpad Voss and some of the findings of Dr. Alexander that there's just no man-made instrument that can smell as sensitive as a dog.
That's changing rapidly, but I'll accept that.
I mean, even Dr. Arpad Voss, who's at the cutting edge and creates the instrument called the Labrador, et cetera, to try to capture that residual odor, right? He's able to do it, but he would acknowledge not even to the level of a canine's nose.
It's my opinion that Dr. Arpad Voss is not necessarily the cutting edge work. He's done incredible, excellent work, but there are other labs which are going in other directions. But yes.
Okay. But you'd agree that well-trained dogs and certified dogs, if they're trained properly, they can tell us what they're smelling by their trained final responses, right?
With a high, what I believe to be, for the court of law, a relatively high error rate, yes.
Well, it's a useful tool in the field. You'd at least agree with me on that, right?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Sorry. It's a useful tool in the field. You'd at least agree with me on that.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
And they're sent out to do what we can't do in matters of importance on a regular basis, right?
That is correct.
They're sent out to find a missing child in the woods sometimes, right?
Correct. Correct.
They're used to scan for explosives in airports, for example. Very serious, important work, right?
Correct.
They're sent out to find the bodies of loved ones out in the field so that they can have closure, right?
Correct.
And they help police every day in different tasks like finding drugs and keeping people safe. We rely upon them for that because of their ability with their nose and their ability to tell us what they find, right?
Absolutely correct.
And what you'd like to see is some corroboration when you see these findings, such as blood, such as bones, such as DNA.
Correct.
Now, you'd agree with me that a trained human remains detection dog is not going to be any use to anyone if it hits on every single hair in a house. Wouldn't you agree with that?
That's correct.
And you'd agree with me that a trained human remains detection dog is not going to be any use to anyone if they hit on every skin cell that's been sloughed off on a piece of furniture, right?
Correct.
The reason they're deployed to do the work that they do is they're able to distinguish those types of things where they'd hit on every couch, bed, and bathroom in every single house they go into, right?
That's correct.
You'd agree, we already talked about certification being important, but there are other things that you would describe as good qualities in a handler, right? Good policies they do, good training and work that they do, right?
Correct.
So rewarding even when a dog finds nothing, that's something that you would agree is a good thing to do.
Yes.
And a good handler also, you prefer a single discipline, right?
That's correct.
And you prefer working off leash to help reduce cueing, right?
That's correct.
And you also agree that less information about what they're going to find, as in specific areas of evidence, for example, is a good thing to reduce cueing as well.
Correct.
And then they should be trained on what they're going to do. For example, I think you testified on direct. You talked about using large source training if you want to find large source scent, correct?
Correct.
Okay. All of these qualities make for a better handler.
Correct.
You'd agree with me with regard to Karen Corcoran and Molly that you believe them in your expert opinion to be a higher quality team, correct?
That is correct.
And in your expert opinion, you were happy to say that Corcoran's team was much higher quality than others you've seen.
That's correct.
And you were happy to report that there were good records, good training techniques, and good quality of training, correct?
Absolutely correct.
And those were all things that you said on June 19th, 2019, indicating that her and Molly were a good team even before you realized that she'd been certified annually by a national agency as well.
Correct.
Thank you, sir.
Redirect?
Thanks, Your Honor. Dr. Haw, is the concern here that the training Mr. Johnson has been referring to was not in residual odor detection?
Well, the concern is twofold. The first is, of course, that the training was not in residual odor detection. The second is that I think that the training team that we're talking about was very high quality, which means it's going to meet the highest level of or I guess I should say the lowest level of error rate, the highest proper success rate. And that's about 60 to 80%. And so I believe that she and her team is easily able to accomplish that 70% accuracy that we have from the scientific literature.
Hold
I-
on. What's your objection?
I object to that information without a citation to some kind of literature or study based on the nature of his expertise.
You know what? I'm going to overrule you. Go ahead.
With respect to the study that the prosecution was just referring to by Michael Alexander, would you disagree with his finding that remains in soil from under a decomposing human, that a dog could detect that? So if the body was removed, but it had decomposed over the soil, isn't it your position, as you discussed in discussing grave soil, that a dog could do that?
Oh, certainly. Absolutely. No question.
So you're not in fact disagreeing with what this Alexander researcher said, right?
If that's what Alexander said, then then it's absolutely correct. I agree, and that's been substantiated numerous times.
The prosecution was inquiring after your remarks that residual odor is something that has reduced concentration and different compounds than a scent source actually present.
Correct.
And is that part of these things being perishable?
That's correct. Each of these volatile organic compounds will decompose at different rates, and so the actual signal changes over time. And so that's a huge issue with how the training is done as well, because if the training is done in rather short order decomposition, and you're looking for long-term things and so on, the signature, the combination of molecules in that signature will change, and that's why I brought it up.
I'm worried that I've gotten so in the weeds on these understandings that it might be missed on normal people, but would it be fair to say that a stinky shoe smells different when you stick it right under your nose than, say, a room that smells like stinky shoes? Are there different volatile organic compounds that a sensing creature senses when they have their nose right at the shoe, or when they just walk into a room where there was once a stinky shoe? Does that make sense?
I'm not sure. If the
What?
stinky room is stinky from exactly the same reason as the stinky shoe, they'll smell the same unless there's been a different time element, because these things disappear and decompose at different rates.
I see.
So I'm not sure where you're going with that question.
Okay, maybe a bad analogy. Is it fair to say that different volatile organic compounds are present if you have a decomposing body than if you have a room where a decomposing body once was but has now been removed?
Objection. He answered this question on cross-examination to suggest that he had no studies to support this, so it's beyond his expertise.
Mr. Marin?
The concentration of volatile organic compounds in a particular location changes over time. I think that's what he means by perishable. I just want to have some clarification as to these questions.
I'll let you do it. Go ahead.
Doctor, does it make sense? I'm sorry about the stinky shoe analogy. Does that make more sense to consider it in that way?
From basic scientific chemistry, basic principles, volatile organic chemicals break down at different rates. So time is an influence and will alter the chemical signature of the room or the shoe or whatever.
Has there been study to confirm that at 24 to 48 hours, that residual odor will leave or will dissipate if there is nothing left there? If there's no hairs, no fingernails, nothing, it's totally removed. The science, what does it say?
Okay, so the evidence that we have and the basis for my opinion about residual odor is based on the literature from the breakdown, the many chemical studies of the breakdown of volatile organic compounds. So the studies have not been done in the framework of murder scene, death, forensics, and what we're calling residual odor. We're stepping back to first principles and our understanding of the breakdown of volatile organic chemicals, which is almost entirely completed in 24 to 48 hours.
What scientifically is the problem where the trained response of the animal is not corroborated by finding something?
Could you restate the question? I'm sorry.
Yes, sir. What is the problem with the alert where it's not corroborated, where you don't find something?
The problem with an alert where you don't find something is we don't know why the dog is alerting. These dogs are not perfect. They're animals. They make mistakes. And so if the dog gives an alert and you find something, hurrah, good for the dog, good for the evidence pool and everything else. You may have found something, as was pointed out by the prosecution, that we would not have found otherwise. Very useful. But if the dog alerts and there's nothing there, there are multiple reasons why the dog may have alerted, including cueing, rewarding, or maybe a residual odor. But we don't know. And so the probability of those false positives is high enough, in my opinion, that they do not provide realistic, valid information. Was that clear?
I think so. Another thing inquired after a moment ago was that these dogs are helpful in finding lost people, finding drugs. If drugs are not found, though, should we treat people as though they had the drugs because of an alert?
Objection.
That is
Yeah,
arguable.
and it's beyond
That
this.
is something you can argue to the jury if you want to on closing.
Doctor, were the carpet studies called into question by other reputable scientists?
Yes, in personal communication.
And the findings that were described by the prosecution with this carpet study, they have not been replicated to your knowledge?
That
Is
is
that fair?
correct. Yes.
And you've been, how long have you been aware of this study?
Oh, many years.
And have you been watching out for someone to corroborate it? Would that be interesting based on your field of study?
Yes, it would be. We're in the midst of, we've just completed submitting a proposal to replicate the work ourselves with my colleagues at the University of Tennessee. And so we are very aware of that literature.
And one of the folks you work with at the University of Tennessee is a gentleman referenced by the prosecutor, Arpad Voss. Do you recall that question?
Yes.
And
And are you aware that Arpad Voss sampled the air in the Dodge in this case?
Objection.
Yes.
First,
hold on.
that's not true. So if he just answered that, then he doesn't know. But the counsel just injected something into the case that is false. And we can approach if necessary, Josh.
Been testified to by multiple witnesses,
No,
and
I don't believe it has. I
The-
think
the
it was.
vacuum.
I believe it was mentioned that that was a possibility. I don't believe it was ever mentioned that it was done. It's the jury's memory. Get off this issue. But the jury's memory is what matters as to what the evidence was, not ours. Go ahead.
based on your scientific understanding, is it fair to think that residual has a time limit on it? Or is some place that once smelled of something going to always smell of that thing?
Residual, I firmly believe from scientific principles that residual odor will have a time limit.
Is it helpful to think of it in terms of how you will not always smell like the Subway sandwich shop you went into or the pizza place you went into? Eventually that smell will dissipate.
Objection. This has all been asked and answered at this point, Judge.
It's pretty obvious too. I mean, I'm going to sustain it just on the waste of time factor.
Professor, when you were invited to be a part of this case, did you learn that the dog Molly that you were asked about was at that point already deceased?
Yes, I believe I was.
Objection to relevance.
Well, it's relevant based on your questions.
So what we were left with, or what you were left with, were reports provided by Karen Corcoran. Is that fair?
That's correct.
And you made your opinion based on reports that she wrote.
In part, yes.
And there were some questions about how Molly had, in fact, on occasion found bodies. Is that surprising based on her training?
No.
And with description of an occasion where 4 years after a body had been removed, there was still residual present, are there circumstances where you believe that might be the case? For instance, some confined area where there are things present?
Yeah, it certainly could occur in a confined area. It could also occur if there actually is material still somewhere present in the area.
So an extreme decomposition event that occurs in the trunk of a car, that trunk might smell like decomposition for a long time. Is that consistent with your scientific expertise?
Certainly, that would slow down that breakdown of the residual odor, or it's a complex environment, and it's possible, for instance, that while the dog indicated there, a forensic team was not able to locate the materials which are currently decomposing.
The discussion about the volatile organic compounds that have been identified, isn't it true that they have not all been identified? They've narrowed it down and they think they've got an idea. But is anybody saying we know exactly what the perfume of death is?
No, it's absolutely not. And what we're actually finding is because of the differing genetics of people and animals, that it differs from person to person in some ways, and we really don't know whether that's in small ways or very large ways.
So when there are, as was discussed, some 400 plus that are associated with humans, you talked about overlap. Does anybody know which ones are overlapping? So are the ones that are associated with humans overlapping with the ones associated with other decomposition?
Yes.
And
If I understand your question, there is an overlap in some of the chemicals. We don't know. It's not done. We haven't quantified them all, as we just said. So we don't know to what degree they overlap, but certainly we know that they do overlap.
And the other sort of confounding thing with those studies is that those compounds exist in different concentrations at different times during the decomposition process. Is that a fair scientific understanding?
That's my understanding, and that's why we don't know these things. Is it's a very complex system, and that's why we don't understand it yet, and so we don't understand what it is exactly that the dogs are detecting.
A body decomposing for less than 24 hours, would that body smell different to a dog than a dog or than a body, say, in a graveyard or that has been decomposing for months?
Those would be emitting different volatile organic compounds, and therefore would have a different signature. Whether the dog distinguishes between them or not, we don't know.
And there was some question about how you had not seen Ms. Corcoran Gumming working her dog. Would it have been helpful to have video of that dog working?
Perhaps to look at the ways that she was or was not minimizing handler error and some things like that. So it usually is useful to get an idea about how the handler team is interacting in both directions, both from the dog point of view as well as from the handler's point of view.
And when you train the trainers, are you giving consultation on how to make those trainings standardized?
Yes. My point is that through my experience as an expert witness, I see where the problems are and where the holes come up. Some of them are just sort of logical holes, or some of them are sort of evidentiary, like recording. And so from what I try to do in my work is, from my point of view, is to help the forensic team, the handler teams, the attorneys, to understand the science behind it, and so to bring better science into the courtroom.
And then lastly, sir, there were some questions about how you get paid. Have you agreed to work for us for a discounted rate?
Yes, I have.
Thank you for that. And who recommended you to us?
Objection or relevance?
What's relevance to that?
The relevance to this is that they've implied that gentleman who lives in Florida is doing this and saying things because he's getting paid to say them instead of because it's scientifically true.
I don't see the relevance.
And he's not sought us out. He was recommended by a national agency.
It's not relevant.
Dr. Ha, do you take your testimony under oath very seriously?
Yes, I do.
Would it compromise your ability to continue your
You can't
work?
ask that question. They can't self-bolster their credibility.
With that, Your Honor, no further questions for the professor.
Okay. Any questions from the jury? Looks like at least one. Okay, Dr. Ha, two questions from the jury. Have you ever seen a cadaver dog work in the field?
Yes, I have.
And what type of case was it, and what was your role?
It was a case in Portland where I was made aware as a professor at the university, made aware that this search was going on, and I was invited to observe because the individuals involved, the handlers involved in it, thought it would be educational for me.
Okay. And can dogs smell through plastic bags?
Yes, they. Let me rephrase that. Depends on the type of plastic bag. There's a lot of different kinds of plastic, and some of the plastic, like your typical garbage bags, are very porous. As we commented on, drug smugglers have discovered that. There are types of plastic which are impervious, and so those are often used in forensic situations where we need to make sure that odors don't mix and so on.
Okay. Any follow-up from either side?
Counsel's witness.
Doctor, is it fair for the jury and everyone to understand you believe in these dogs? You know they can do.
That's not really following up on these questions.
Well, having observed them, the first question.
Have you ever seen them?
Yeah.
What type of case was it? But his belief was not one of these questions. I mean, you're done with your questioning.
The plastic that would need to be involved, would that be some military grade plastic? It's not the garbage bags that we've seen here. Is that fair?
I don't know about military grade. They're just simply different kinds of plastics, and so you'd want to use a specific kind of plastic that doesn't allow air molecules to move across it. It is not garbage bags.
Are there any commercially available garbage bags that are that good?
No.
Or that non-porous?
Yes, as a scientist, I can go to a laboratory supply place and purchase them. So yes, they are commercially available. They are not commonly available, if that's what you're asking.
Not at the grocery store.
Correct.
That's it, thanks.
Anything?
Yes, Your Honor. So, Doctor, you were asked about your work in the field, and you said you've only one case, watched a human remains detection dog, and you were in the role of observing. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You're aware that Karen Corcoran's been doing this for 30 years and did more searches than that in this single case than you've ever even observed, right?
That's misstating the evidence. She wasn't involved for 30 years.
In the field he was referring to, not this case.
Well, I'm sorry, for 30 years she didn't get involved until the 2000s.
You know, I don't remember in any event. I don't think that's a real big difference between 2000s and in any event.
20 years. Let's say 20 years for argument's sake. You're aware she did 4 searches in the field just in this case alone, correct?
Sure. Yes.
With over 40 trained final responses, to which you're attributing her on the basis of no literature, at least a 60% success rate.
Correct.
Correct?
Correct.
And based on your one instance of observing a cadaver dog in the field, you're opining on her reliability.
Absolutely. I have no problem based on scientific principles. I am not opining on her leash handling ability or how she commanded the dog, as we discussed. I am talking
Thank you,
about
sir.
the accuracy overall.
On that one issue, do you have any follow-up?
No, thanks.
Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, our next witness is also going to be by video, so we don't want to break it down and have somebody come in for a short period of time because it's too hard to set up. So remember my admonitions, don't talk about the case either between yourselves or anyone else. Don't let any third party discuss it. Don't talk to the lawyers or any witnesses or the defendant. Don't gather any information on your own. Don't decide this case or start talking about the case until it's all over with and I've told you to do so. So with that, let's start up again at 10 after 1. All right. Everybody rise for the jury? Okay, we'll be in recess. Thank you. You bet. Oh, Dr. Ha, I'm sorry. You're good to go.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Totally forgot about you.
Thank you.
You bet.
Need anything for me? No, we're good. Have a good lunch.